Okay, I think we're recording. Yes. Oh, I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you, Sarah.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Rachel.
Yes. Um, well, I think, for those who are going to watch this later, I'll put the link below to the webinar that you did about cannabis last year, which has a ton of information about like the parts that we do know about the neurobiology of cannabis. I'm really excited though to talk today about more about like sort of what's implicated in using cannabis, like what circuitry is implicated in using cannabis, and sort of starting to think a little bit about what is so mysterious about the sort of like folks use cannabis in so many different ways, and we often people talk about how it affects them so differently, and it's just there's so much mystery around this plant.
Yeah, and as we mentioned in the webinar, it's just so recent that we even realize that there is an endocannabinoid neurotransmitter. It's like the illegality of the substance and the racism that surrounded cannabis made it off limits for any kind of research. And so it wasn't until Israel really took up the banner and discovered the elusive endocannabinoid molecules that we even began to realize that we have this endocannabinoid system, which is literally distributed through our entire body in every single tissue. It's in our nerve tissue, it's in our muscle tissue, it's everywhere. It's an incredible force for our homeostasis and our balance and our well-being. It's a foundational neurotransmitter system. Like if you were looking through your grade school textbook, you've got your lymphatic system, and you've got your breathing system, and you've got your blood system, and you've got your digestive system, and there should be an endocannabinoid system right there with all of those others, because it's that important. It's that foundational.
Yeah. So wild. I'm so grateful that through I imagine through the legalization process in America, perhaps, like, is there more research you imagine that's going to be done moving forward?
I would imagine that it's already taking place, and
Yeah.
that they're now able to do all kinds of things that they weren't able to do for so long.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was intrigued listening to the webinar about the connection between the endocannabinoid system and the play and warmth circuitry.
Yeah, yeah. I was looking for, because I was thinking about cannabis and how we'll use cannabis in various ways. I mean, people are becoming so specific and creative with cannabis. You can go into your cannabis store and you can say, I'm having trouble sleeping, and they'll give you one kind, or you'll say, I'm having trouble with pain from cancer, and they'll give you another kind. I mean, it's becoming so focused and so specific. I think that we're just in a huge learning process. But I was looking specifically when I was doing this research, I was like, okay, so if we are somebody who's really found that cannabis is supportive and helpful for our daily life, what is happening? What are the elements of our cannabis use that we can begin to touch with our needs energies? How can we begin to hold ourselves with warmth, however it is that we're using cannabis? And what I discovered was that there was a enormous correlation. Three things. One is our play circuits. It's the major neurotransmitter for the play circuit. So I think that this the circuitry, the circuits of emotion and motivation in all mammals and in humans is something that was marvelously researched by a neuroscientist of Estonian origin who worked in the United States, who was born in the United States, whose name was Jakk Panksepp. And he died a couple of years ago, but he identified the play circuit, and he said endocannabinoids are the main neurotransmitter for the play circuit. And I think this has huge implications for the importance of the play circuit, because before we began the webinar, you and I were talking, or this recording, you and I were talking about how the molecules of the endocannabinoids were given the name Ananda something, that was a word for that takes us into spirituality and takes us into this sense of joy and delight. So I have this sense that we're on the verge of discovering how important play is for our spirituality and how hungry we are for it. I mean, we're living in a world where so many people are using cannabis to support emotional well-being. And I think there's a hunger that we are in the presence of, a hunger for play, and that the play circuit in itself has something of divinity in it. Um, and and one of the drawbacks of Jakk Panksepp was that he did most of his research, and bless our little animal friends, and with sorrow for the incredible animal research of the 20th century, but he really focused on animal circuitry. He wasn't, of course, able to focus on human circuitry. He was, he would have had to be dissecting us all to look at what was going on. So, so animals are not so articulate about their experience of the divine. It's harder to find. So, but we get to explore. We're in the presence of mystery. This is a very under-researched area where all our own relational neuroscience neurobiologists looking at the world and ourselves and our interaction with the world.
I'm struck because the play circuitry, I remember learning about this from you and thinking, where are the acceptable ways that we get to play in our culture? And it's kind of like, well, it's sort of transmuted into like competitive sports or like
Exactly.
bullying.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Or yeah, things that are like structured. Instead of being spontaneous and emergent.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons that I love constellations so much, which is which is one of the modalities that I use personally in my workshopping, which is a modality where we begin with our functions and our roles together, naming them, and then we just get to see what emerges. I mean, I think it's one of the few ways that humans get to play.
Yes, I love that. Something about the spontaneous delight that what is
Yeah.
so missing is, like you say, unstructured ways of just experiencing joy and delight and pleasure and play.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm remembering that that my understanding is that the play circuitry is in a way like the most impacted by trauma, that it's the first circuit to go offline when
It's
we
not, yeah, it's impacted by trauma, absolutely, but it's also impacted by ordinary stress. It's the first circuit to go offline if there's any fear, if there's any anger, if there's any grief. It doesn't even have to be traumatic anger, fear, or grief. It can just, or even hunger. It's the first, everything kind of needs to be in place to support our emergent play.
Yeah. So this
Yeah.
makes so much sense from that perspective, why cannabis would be such a, but I don't know the data behind this, but
Why
it's
it would be taking the world by storm.
right. That's right.
Yes.
So desperate we are for access to delight and play and
Yeah.
ease, spontaneous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And isn't there as well like a connection between the warmth circuit, the care circuit rather, and
Yes, yes, these are the two most supportive things for our. I think this is marvelous, but it's so countercultural because our whole culture is like do, seeking, getting things done, to-do lists, accomplishments, functions, and what really actually supports our well-being is warmth, which is the warmth of relational connection and play, and also cold showers and cold water are also very supportive of the endocannabinoid system, which I cannot bring myself to. I'm like every day in the shower, I'm like, it would be really good for you, Sarah, if you would do some cold. And I'm like, no. So, but others do. Others are exploring the wonderful, healthful effects of cold water and cold immersion and sleeping on cold beds. Even people are doing, yeah, ice beds and things.
ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
Not my
Yeah,
favorite.
and it's all in support of health and well-being. But the cold, it doesn't go towards the warmth and play for me so much. So
Yeah. Let's find other ways. Like warm water is a nice way of
yes,
experiencing warmth.
yes. I don't know if I've told you this. We have neuroreceptors in our skin that are actually made to perceive the body warmth of other humans. They're neuroreceptors that are they're not made, like, they don't light up if we get too hot. They're not for that. They don't measure if we're being burned or if heat is dangerous. They're only there to tell us that other people are with us. And that's the warmth that our endocannabinoid system is looking for. It's looking for the warmth that comes from being held in resonance, in community, in connection, in relationship.
Yeah, so in that context, it's, of course, in a world where play is, in a sense, like restricted and warmth is impossible to come by as a result of the culture that we've built, like, of course we would seek, substances that allow us to access those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Something about the sort of connection to traumatic experiences and related to using cannabis, or the endocannabinoid system, and how cannabis works with that.
Right. Yes, there's a strong link between the way the brain tries to take care of itself after trauma and endocannabinoids. The brain tries to flush the memory systems with endocannabinoids after traumatic events in order to try to regulate and calm us after something really difficult has happened. So there's a very strong link between our efforts to recover from trauma and our endocannabinoids, which also, now again, we don't have the research for this to see how people with PTSD are using cannabis, and to be able, nobody's done that yet, or they may have, but it's not been it wasn't published as of last spring. So we can speculate that when we have been traumatized and we find cannabis soothing and supportive, then we may very well be trying to augment our brain's natural healing and regulating mechanisms in the aftermath of trauma. And of course, whenever we're talking about endocannabinoids or endogenous opioids or benzodiazepines, all of the endos, all of the ones that we make ourselves, are very quick acting and very quickly disappearing. We're in a constant experience of flexibility and flow and the movement of the neurotransmitters when we're not augmenting with external plant substances. But when we bring the plant substances in, then we start to change the way that timing happens for the brain. So part of what happens when we use cannabis medicinally for trauma is that, just like when we use opioids medicinally for trauma, which we can very easily do, because they really impact the warmth circuit also, the care circuit also. When we do this, we're flooding our brain with the right substance, but it doesn't move through us in the same way. It's much longer persisting. So we'll see effects, for example, on math tests. If someone smokes cannabis or takes cannabis, and then for 3 days they have a decreased cognitive capacity. Whereas if the brain itself is creating an endocannabinoid flow from actual experiences of warmth and care, then it'll flash in, do its job, and flush out in a very different way.
Yeah, makes sense.
I wonder, how is it for you to be talking about this? I wonder what it's like for you to be in this conversation.
Yeah, I it's relaxing.
Mm.
um, yeah, having spent so much of my life using cannabis as a strategy to for for self-soothing, for being with traumatic experiences, for dealing with sort of a feeling of alarmed aloneness, for the sort of longing to know how to access pleasure and play when my brain is, lacerating itself.
Yes.
So there's sort of a relaxation in my body, like, of course. Of
Mm.
course I would reach for cannabis, and of course it would be, that it would feel, in the moments where I've attempted to reduce my usage for various reasons, it feels like I'm saying goodbye to like a savior, a substance that's been a savior for so many moments.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I'm intrigued about how, for example, like constellations might be. Part of it is like wanting to understand. So I have a sense of why I use cannabis, just based on working with you and understanding, a little bit of this neuroscience of the endocannabinoid system. And there's still a sense of like, there's curiosity about like what are the other kind of what are the other ways that I might be able to access these things if I choose not to use that cannabis as a
Mm.
substance as often. And so part of what is intriguing about using constellations is like that it feels a little bit like a riddle. It's almost like, part of me is kind of like, no, there's only this strategy really works. Like, why would I want another strategy? And yet, there's side effects in my own cannabis use that are like not desirable, so.
So there's a curiosity, and my understanding that there's sort of a simultaneous wariness, like I'm not sure that anything else really is a very good option. And there's also like a curiosity about in a way where your words are taking me is toward the work that I've been doing with unconscious contracts and substances. Because one of the things that I received from a wonderful person in Columbus, Ohio, who said to me, "Oh, when you're working with addictions or dependencies, the substance has a contract with you. You don't just have a contract with the substance." And so I've been, experimenting with that since this person. Well, it took me like a year. I kind of was like, "What does this person mean?" And I turned it over and over in my brain for a year, and then I said, okay, I think I understand. And I started to do it with people. Like for me, sugar does many of the things that you're mentioning that cannabis does for you. So what is sugar saying to me? What are its contracts with me? And interestingly, I think the sugar actually has a connection with the endocannabinoid system, because uh, I discovered the efficacy of cannabis for difficult living situations when I was 13 years old, living with my mom, and that was a very hard time for my mom. And I would smoke uh, weed, and then I would there was a whole like thing I was doing with sugar that was connected. And sometimes I wonder whether there was a kind of an arc of connection between the cannabis and the sugar, that then the sugar persisted, carrying with it whatever little messages or baggage it had, from the cannabis use. So it feels like it very well has connections for me, that the sugar is saying, much as the cannabis did, I will take care of you, Sarah. I will take care of you. I will help you experience warmth and play. And there are lots of levels and details and clarity and unpeeling that we get to do, that I find really sweet, because it's not there's no demand energy of like having to get rid of whatever the substance is, it's like we get to actually explore what is it trying to do for us, and do we have a sense when we get into the nitty-gritty that something different could happen? Because I think one of the things you're pointing to is that when there's this blanket request to stop using something, then it's like all of the nitty-gritty gets turned into an enormous, avalanche of support, instead of us getting to look at what are the different snowflakes, what are the different snow fields of support. And when we work with it at that level, it's less panicking, because we're not through. It's like we're getting really specific with our inquiry about whether we want it to do exactly this, or whether exactly this could be cared for in a different way.
Yeah, it makes me think that so I've written a couple articles that I think you've seen on Medium about my, process
Your
and
journey, yeah.
with cannabis. And I am at a place where the more I've done sort of, frankly, like ancestral healing work, the more sense of sort of secure attachment I have to myself and to my ancestors, the less urgency there is in each moment when I feel an urge to, for example, like use cannabis in order to access play or warmth. There's more space in me to say, I'm just really wanting play right now. And then there's space I can say, do I want to use cannabis to do that? Maybe. Sometimes the answer is yeah. Sometimes the answer is no, actually I don't. Like, how else can I do that? And so there's more space.
That's beautiful.
And
the ancestral healing work happens very, very organically in the constellation process, as well as in other modalities. I know people are doing very specific and beautiful ancestral healing work that has a different quality than constellation work, but constellation work is one way to move into that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about constellation work to work with these, what might some of the, like, how I guess I'd love to hear sort of your sense of how constellations might be an inquiry, a modality that would be well served to this inquiry. How can I not, either for folks, if I imagine folks might have, how can I not use cannabis versus how can I have more choice with cannabis versus what's really underneath this?
All questions that are wonderful. One of the ways we can work when we're doing constellation work is we can look at the different elements of the question and put them in motion with one another. So we can, for example, if you and I were working together and we had a circle, instead of this being an empty room, there was a circle of people here. You could say, I choose Jade to be me, and I think I would like to see Jade in relationship with cannabis, and also I'd like to see my endocannabinoid system in this picture. And then we would set up these three and begin to see, when you put it outside yourself, when you take it outside yourself, how much of a burden does that release from you, and what begins to happen once we look at it systemically and look at it as a system that's supposed to be fluid and moving, but is probably stuck and stopped in some place. And what are the elements that need to be named that have not been named? And what are the contracts that may be in place that are no longer necessary, that are keeping the system static instead of fluid and responsive to life?
So it's almost like constellations is a way of sort of almost like externalizing or three-dimensionalizing our internal experience, to say what's happening, to see where the tangles, to see the draws of movement toward and away.
Yeah, and when you first stumble into this modality, you think, how could someone else know me or my endocannabinoid system or cannabis? How could someone else be able to hold what's true for me? And yet the most remarkable, this is where play comes in, I think, the most remarkable things begin to emerge, and people so often are like, how could they know this? How could, yes, this is exactly right. And how could it be that people who are strangers to me, for example, would be able to be my mother in this way that captures some element of her being? How could somebody be me and capture some element of my being if they've never met me before? It's quite a quite a tribute to our shared humanness, and how much we are already knowing about each other without even knowing that we know it. How much our bodies know about the fields of information that each of us is carrying with us.
I imagine maybe folks who are listening and watching might not have a sense of how constellations work. Do you want to say a little bit about?
Sure. With constellations, you can either do them in one-on-one sessions, and you can use objects, and you can say, oh, here's my endocannabinoid system, and here's cannabis for me, and here's me, and now I'm just going to take a look and put these three little beings in relationship with one another. Let's see, I'm here, my endocannabinoid system is way over here, and cannabis is right in front of me. We could do that with objects and then begin to talk about it and feel into it. But when we're working with groups of people, we can choose people to represent different elements of the system that we're looking at, or different elements of the question that we're looking at. And we start in different ways depending on what questions people have. So, like you had mentioned, several possibilities. Somebody might be interested in, what are the deeper issues that I don't know about that are here? Or someone else might be interested in, um, uh, how do I stop? Or how do I have more choice? Then those questions then can be brought into the circle. And as the people who are representing the different elements of the system are moving, or are stuck, or in dialogue, or can't speak, then what we're looking for is, what are the things, there are three things we're looking for when we start to work in this way with a system, to see how a system can begin to move again. One of them is, what are the elements that have never been named? So, for example, if somebody doesn't know that play and warmth are important elements in their relationship with cannabis, then what's it like to name those? Or, for example, if someone doesn't realize that they have a sense of being all alone in the world and not having any ancestors, what is it like if we bring ancestors and work with the relationship? How does that change a person's sense of being supported or unsupported in the world? All of these different, they're all different elements that can be brought in depending on where we're working systemically. So we can work with a system of a person's internal world, my endocannabinoid system, cannabis, and me. We can work with a family. We can work with my relationship with cannabis, my mother and her relationship with cannabis. And then we're starting to work with a family. What happens generationally with warmth and play for grandparents and great-grandparents? What kinds of historical events have impacted a family, making play and warmth impossible? The Irish potato famine, for goodness sake, makes play and warmth very tentative in a family history. Um, and then we can also work socially, systemically. Like, what are the effects of poverty? What are the effects of choicelessness? What are the effects of racism? How can we take a look at this? What are these impacts on this body in this world? So the choices about where we work systemically really come from the person's question. So sometimes people are like, I really want to know about the social systemic level of my relationship with cannabis. How does historical trauma, how does privilege, how does how do experiences of lack or loss, historically or socially, how do those impact this body's capacity to move into warmth and play. So you can look at different levels of question so very easily with constellation work.
Mm. Fun. There's a question emerging for me around something I've noticed in my use of cannabis, as well as, you just wouldn't believe how many people flooded my email inbox after I've written these articles saying, I've had the exact same experience. I'm so curious about what this is about. And it's related to spirituality and kind of a sense of oneness, and this way that my, in whatever way I'm using it for play or warmth or whatever, there's a fairly reliable experience of connection to, especially connection to the natural world, and a sense that I'm, I'm talking to the plants, and I feel connected, like I'm part of the world. It's a sense of like being in deep relationship with
That's so
all life.
I wonder, I mean, there's no research about this yet because of the illegal status for so many years of cannabis. I mean, other things were illegal, but they were doing research on them. I don't understand. There was just a huge prejudice against cannabis that really prevented us knowing a little bit more. But we could speculate that that being that 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 flooding our bodies with endocannabinoids, might just really be an invitation to participating in especially the plant world. I mean, it's like we're inviting ourselves to become even more plant when we flood our bodies with cannabis. We're inviting ourselves to participate, to join uh, the sort of the world's natural system, I think, in some ways. So it's quite an enticing and wonderful naming, I think.
It makes me curious about the connection, again, back to the play and the care circuitry, that if there's some sort of connection, I mean, it seems to me that it's like when we don't have a sense that we're cared for, and we don't have ability to inhabit, social engagement, which, play and being in a dance with other living beings, then we wouldn't have the opportunity to talk to plants, for example, or because there's this sort of experience of being isolated, being in your own little bubble.
Yeah, like what happens if we're deeply balanced? What happens if we are in homeostasis? Do we naturally have more of a sense of connection with the external world and the plant world and the world of nature? But I'm also really struck by the history of the use of cannabis for spirituality in indigenous populations. Really struck by a kind of a universality of the way that it, like some other plant medicines, provides spiritual access beyond the ordinary.
Yeah, there's something, it's like kind of tickling me. I can't get at it, but it's something about like when we don't have enough, when we're not receiving warmth and care, um, we just have a sense that we're kind of alone in the world. We're in some sort of little bubble where we're not in a dance with life. And so I wonder if there's some way, like flooding the body with endocannabinoids and having a sense, like we're, there's both the spontaneous delight of the play circuit, and then there's a sense of this warmth and care around, like, I'm a living being and I belong here and I matter. And that it's almost like, I wonder if that sort of opens up a potential to understand the way, and in a way, like, to see, it's not that it's creating relationships, it's that our nervous systems can actually experience that we are already always in relationship with
Yeah.
seen and unseen beings.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, that's exciting to imagine. There's some I'm curious if you have any more, like where, if you have any sense of like the history of cannabis being used by indigenous populations. I wonder, I imagine you don't mean just sort of Turtle Island indigenous people, but like those cultures that are in intact wovenness or have been in the past using cannabis in particular?
I don't have a ton of information there.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a wondering about the way that the Turtle Island folks have always used it as a support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And very interesting to think about its presence in the Caribbean and the way in which it in the reggae kind of world, it was definitely a spiritual invitation. It was a devotion.
Mm-hmm.
And then thinking also about the impact of trauma on the Caribbean with the mass enslavement and the brutality of the enslavement there. It just makes sense as a sort of remedy or medicine for the enormity of trauma.
Yeah, yeah, I think I'd like to learn more. I mean, I know originally cannabis was cultivated in India and was at some point, through probably colonization, just exported and then cultivated in different cultures and perhaps perhaps like continued the process of using, altered states of consciousness of all
Yeah,
kinds.
right. All kinds of plant medicines have been so important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm just going to check the notes to see if there was anything else that especially.
Rastafarian. That's the word I was looking for when I said reggae culture. Yeah.
I'm just dropping in to see if there's other sort of questions that are emerging. One of the questions that of these the flooding of emails from the articles I've written are folks saying, I don't want to give up cannabis forever. It's like we're in this culture, this sort of like no, and I want to say like blessings and acknowledgement to all the folks who decide to choose sort of complete sobriety.
Yes, whatever people
Right.
want.
Whatever people want.
What we want to support.
Right. And there's a sort of culture that I have a lot of critique of, which I sometimes call recovery porn. It's this idea that like, if, the only way to be truly recovered is to like be completely sober, or like you're failing. A lot of people that said like, congratulations on your sobriety and like, good luck never smoking again. It was, and kind of making cannabis into the enemy, like get rid of that crutch, and it's this sense of like, I want to be able to be in deep relationship with substances if I choose. It's just that I want more choice.
Yeah.
As I've said, I've experienced a lot of success just in different ways through ancestral healing and more secure attachment work, to have more choice. And the question that comes up routinely is folks saying, how can I have more choice? And part of that response from me is more is about like harm reduction, that there's ways to make different choices in some moments and do things that are supportive. And I wonder if you have any.
Well, just this invitation to really enter the dialogue with the substance, and to really enter the dialogue in a way with our trauma, and to enter a dialogue with our alarmed aloneness. All of these things are key for our movement and growth, and may very well have unexpected impacts on how good it feels to not be under the influence of something. Because there is something really wonderful about being able to feel the actual flow of our neurotransmitters in relationship to life, that that carries a lot of promise of beauty, of a different kind, of a fluidity, and an organic continual emergence that we don't get to feel as much if we're choiceless with our substances, whether they're alcohol or cannabis or opioids, or there's the addictive processes of the brain are a solution to trauma, and are a solution to loneliness and to alarmed aloneness, and are a solution to a world, like you said, that doesn't have warmth and play in it. But it's a heavy-handed solution. And maybe we would enjoy beginning to gradually explore moments where we are in an emergent, responsive relationship with the world that's just slightly faster than what the taking in of substances permits, because they last so much longer in the brain. Did I answer your question at all? Not exactly.
Each time you say things, there's a million more, questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is partially what you're saying, that there's information in those moments of sort of when the urge arises to use a substance to care for something, that there's information.
Absolutely there is, yeah. There's absolutely information about how we're doing.
Yeah, so I wonder if part of the work is just sort of creating sort of just enough space in the moments where we are longing for to feel different than we do,
Yeah.
If there's a sort of process for slowing down just enough to inquire, what am I really needing here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes as a result of the impacts of trauma, there's like an impossibility somehow of being the body sensations of, panic and.
Yeah, they're big. They need to be taken care of somehow.
Yeah.
And there's a way that the use of any kind of substance or addictive behavior helps us to manage those things on our own, without having to have other people be able to figure out how to help us, which is a slow process. Us figuring out how to help ourselves, us learning to lean into others, and us learning to lean into some kind of, I think, divine sustenance and nourishment.
That leads me back to the care circuitry and warmth. Do you use those interchangeably?
I tend to talk about warmth probably a little more, and then because the care circuitry sounds like a little technical. But the warmth travels on that care circuitry.
The warmth travels on the care circuitry.
Yeah.
I wonder about the relationship between alarmed aloneness, which I know is a sort of an activation, or like runs along the grief panic circuit, which is the circuit that gets activated when we're taken away from our people, or
Yeah.
so I wonder, like, what is the connection between, is it just that when we have a sense of alarmed aloneness, like the thing that would soothe us is warmth?
Yes, because to get technical, when we have alarmed aloneness, then we have falling endogenous opioids, and we have rising cortisol, which is why the opioid epidemic is also so enormous on our continent. Is because we live in a world which is remarkably low on warmth. And so there's some interwovenness and interaction that we don't yet know the ins and outs of between the play circuitry and the warmth circuitry, between this system that's so fueled by endocannabinoids and this system that's so fueled by opioids. So it's almost like once the warmth gets balanced out, once the need for warmth is met, once we're really being nourished by warmth, then the endocannabinoids get to be more in balance. It's like there's a dependency between the neurotransmitter system of the endocannabinoids and our endogenous opioids. So if the endogenous opioids are out of whack, if we're in a state of alarmed aloneness, which is where we lose our endogenous opioids, we lose our oxytocin, we have this huge flow of stress, of cortisol. When that happens, then, it can be like there are those of us who find the path to opioids and go, okay, the opioids are really solving the problem here. But there are those of us who will find like the path to resolution being more getting the endocannabinoids back on track so that the opioid system can kind of relax and come into balance itself. So I think we're just very complexly made. So some people's systems find more comfort from cannabis, and some people's systems find more comfort from Oxycontin or fentanyl. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like just back to the endocannabinoid system and the play circuit. It's that we may not be in those moments, say when we're feeling alarmed aloneness and the cortisol is high and the oxytocin and the endogenous opioids are low. There's a sense of like wanting sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. Let's see if I can get back to it.
That if we can bring the play circuit back up, the warmth circuit will come back online, kind of.
Yeah.
That's my sense of it, at any rate.
Well, I wonder, oh, I see, I remember where I was going. That just perhaps that, again, because the research is so new around the endocannabinoid system, that there's some way in which the balance capacity, that
Yes,
not sort of
absolutely.
simply about play, but just like it's about balance and
It is,
homeostasis.
absolutely. It's all about balance and homeostasis and well-being. It's like we cannot have well-being. It's like we can't have well-being without warmth and play. We cannot have well-being without our endogenous cannabinoids. It's not possible.
Yeah.
We think, oh, we'll have well-being if we get all of our to-do list items done, but it is not true. It is a fallacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I get curious again about how we know that endocannabinoids flood the system in moments of trauma to sort of
Yes.
buttress.
Again, we're working with the very sort of baby beginnings of research where we've got, a couple centuries of research into the opioids. And we have 40 years of research into the endocannabinoids. So, so we don't know a ton yet there. All we know is that they're involved in the memory tissues, the hippocampus, the amygdala.
Mm. Yeah. Have you heard of the term endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome?
Oh my goodness. It sounds like our world. It sounds like the whole North American continent.
Right. Someone commented on one of the stories, like, it sounds like you have endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. And, as a psychiatric survivor, I have like alarm that comes up anytime someone tells me I have sort of anything that's like, sounds so kind of concrete and static like that. But it did make me curious about the impact over time of using, external cannabinoids.
Certainly, if it is if it is like the other neurotransmitters, when we start flooding ourselves with external sources of our neurotransmitters, we stop creating, we're always trying to create balance. So we'll stop creating we'll pull in the neurotransmitter receptors so that we can have more balance. That's what happens with methamphetamines, is that we pull in our dopamine receptors. With methamphetamines, it takes like 9 months to begin to recover our endogenous neurotransmitter receptors for dopamine, which means that there can be this very long period for folks who are going off methamphetamines where there's just no pleasure in the world. Yeah, so it's a long haul of regrowing dopamine neurotransmitters. But I don't know what the research is about growing and regrowing and retracting and endocannabinoid receptors yet. Yeah. Do you have a sense? Is there something, like, you're someone who's been sort of playing in this area of, do I want to be using cannabis? Do I not want to be using cannabis? Is there a sense of some sort of, and we know that cognitive capacity is impacted for 3 days after, for at least 3 days after the use of cannabis. So we know there's some, that there are effects over time. Do you have a sense, like an anecdotal sense in this moment?
Of
Of a way that you have less energy or something, or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I notice it only after a sort of prolonged use period, say 3 days of smoking, smoking sort of most moments in 3 days, for example. It does leave me with a sense, it's not exactly, doesn't feel like cognitive decline. It's more a sense of like, I can't access any pleasure. Nothing, everything's the worst. I just, like, my brain is highly focused on what's wrong, and I just feel like everything's just gonna, it's just a sense of flatness.
Yeah, very interesting. I have a friend who goes on vacation with me and very kindly stops using marijuana while this person is on vacation with me, which is very kind, because I have a sense of them not being there and when they're smoking cannabis, and it takes like 2.5 to 3 days before they have normal appetite and they can sleep. So I know that also happens, but these are all anecdotal pieces rather than the research that I was able to find. I don't think they have quite good research yet.
Yeah. I wonder if it's just some mini version of the receptors being so flooded that they sort of suck back up, and then there's no production of natural cannabis.
And if people are relying, like if my friend is relying on the cannabis for appetite regulation, for sleep regulation, and then it's gone away, then they have to regrow or reestablish a natural. Yeah.
And there's also, it feels, this is again purely anecdotal, but it's a sense of like getting out of the habit of relating to challenging moments. I spend a bunch of time using cannabis in a very particular way to care for overwhelm or loneliness or a sort of sense like, oh, I'm not feeling very playful. If I use it for a while, it's almost like I get out of the habit of going, oh, I don't feel so good in this moment. What do I want to do? You know, there are a million other strategies for meeting these needs. But when I habitually go to cannabis, it's almost like my imagination becomes a little bit limited.
Yeah.
And perhaps like at some level, the nervous system and endocannabinoid system, you know, are.
And I think this is characteristic of so many of our substances and our behaviors that are addictive, is that the addiction becomes the solution for everything. Yeah.
So fun to talk about this. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Do you want to talk a little bit about the event that we're hosting together in Portland on the 29th of February?
On the 29th of February, come and join us for an embodied exploration of yourself in relationship to cannabis. And if you are enticed and interested by this dialogue, not because of its focus on cannabis, but because of its focus on constellations and healing and exploration and all kinds of substances, you're also very welcome, because we need representatives for the people who want to do a little work totally focused. That you might end up being somebody's mother, or you might end up being able to be cannabis, or to be someone's endocannabinoid system and to feel what it feels like. There are all kinds of interesting movements toward healing, for everybody, for warmth and for play and for emergence and spontaneity in these workshops. They're always surprising.
Yeah, and so mysterious, like delightfully mysterious. I mean, and I don't mean so often we leave with mystery, but it's somehow a sense of like there being a mystery at the beginning, and that there's movement in some way that explains something that's
Deep things, deep currents we get to touch, bring to life, speak about, have more compassion for ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
End this recording.